Do you have an upper diastasis that's having a hard time healing? Or have you been told that maybe your ribs rest in a little bit of a wider angle? Now, as we go to work on that area, we might need to work on rib cage mobility, shoulder mobility, and core strength. However, one other area we can look at is what's happening in the hips and pelvis. So what we can think about is when we have a lack of movement in one place, we might drive more movement elsewhere. So thinking of this for the hips and pelvis, we can think about it in a few different ways. One of the ways we're going to think about is with breathing and diaphragm and pelvic floor mechanics. So as we go to inhale, our diaphragm pulls down, which pulls our rib cage wide. That's going to put pressure down onto our organs and help our organs kind of descend into our pelvic floor, giving a little bit of stretch and spring load. And then as we exhale, the organs unload because of that kind of recoil effect from the pelvic floor and go back up inside of our rib cage, and ribs come back in together. Now, if someone has tightness in the pelvic floor or in their backside of their pelvis, they might have a hard time sending that breath down. So what can end up happening is that they go to inhale and they run out of room to inhale further down. So then just kind of keep expanding their ribs and expanding up instead of getting that breath to go down. This is also going to affect pelvic floor and lower ab mechanics, because as we go to inhale up, then we're going to exhale down instead of wanting to inhale down and then exhale up. So one exercise to help with this is a full squat breathing. So what you're going to do is you're going to grab onto something sturdy, feet and knees together, and you're going to hold low, and you're going to sit back into a squat with your arms on either side of your knees here. Front ankles are relaxed, hips are relaxed, and you're kind of stretching into it. You're going to inhale into your back and hips, and then exhale and feel yourself kind of sink down into it a little bit more. Inhaling again, and exhaling. So as you're here, you should feel the underneath side of your pelvis and the back side of your pelvis kind of open and relax and lower down a little bit more with each inhale and exhale. If it feels too vulnerable for you down there, then you can always sit on something or explore opening up the back of your hips in other ways. Some ways that might help you highlight that your breath isn't going down is if you go into that position and you go to inhale and your hips kind of rise up and then exhale and sink down. That can indicate that there's some of that restriction back there, that maybe you need to do a little soft tissue release work first. And again, just really focus on gently encouraging that breath to go back and down instead. Now, going back to opening up the backside of your hips in other ways, we can look at a hinge and see how we can do movement from the back of our pelvis, or we end up doing movement from our ribs instead. So when we go to do a split stance hinge here, what we can think about is, okay, as I go to hinge down, I want to think about the back of my hips opening up here to help lengthen the backside of my pelvis. What can happen is if everything is restricted back here, you can kind of fake your way down by flaring your ribs forward and kind of leading from here, getting more of the movement and extension from this thoracic lumbar area, lengthening your abs and widening your ribs in front instead of opening back here. So you might need to focus on is paying attention to your ribs and hip bones being connected in the front to decrease the mobility there as you then drive more of the movement in the backside here, okay? Now, for coming back up, we can also look at how the spine can be doing the movement instead of the hips. So what it might be is you might look pretty good going down, but then to come back up, maybe you drive the movement more with your paraspinals here, flaring those ribs again, instead of getting that extension and movement from your glutes and your hamstrings to pull you back up. Sometimes it can happen right on this transition point here. Other times people might look pretty good, and then when they go to finish off that last little bit, that they flare instead of bringing their hips down and through. So we got to think about how that coming back up is going to set up the next lowering back down. The lowering back down helps set up the coming back up. Another move that can help you really identify how someone extends in their hip is looking at a bridge. So if I go to lay down here on my back in whatever bridge or hip thrust position that you're in, when we go to come up, ideally we want this nice flat line where we're getting this pure extension movement from my pelvis using glutes and hamstrings here. Now, what can happen is that as people come up, they might be like, all right, I'm tucked and I'm good here. But then to get a little bit higher, they flare their ribs and arch their back higher up here. So again, they're driving that movement from the rib cage, which we're trying to work on closing if it's a little bit wider, and trying to get more of the movement from the hips and pelvis instead. So focusing on thinking about those hips and ribs connection here. And then as they come up, oftentimes I'll cue thinking about a small child sitting on your ribs to help keep them down as they tuck under and lift up a little bit higher on their hips. To them, it might feel like that they go as high at first because they're going from the area of greater limitation, but it's going to really isolate that movement and have them feeling it more in their more in their glutes and hamstrings and less in their backs. But hopefully this gives you a few different ideas of areas to look at or movements to look at that might be contributing to that wide rib cage angle and diastasis up top that you haven't quite explored yet because you've kind of been attacking it at the source of the area rather than looking at other driving factors.